Welcome back to the Shakespeare Showdown show. This is episode number 4 in round 4 of the Romeo and Juliet Showdown. In this round, we are going to pick up immediately where we left off in the last episode. In fact, there will even be some overlap. Quite a bit of overlap, actually. We are at the beginning of Act 2, Scene 3, which is the introduction of the friar, or Friar Lawrence, I should say, because there's going to be another friar later on. And we now have 7 contestants remaining in our tournament. When we first meet Friar Lawrence, he is in his cell, which is like a monastery or something like that. In movie and TV versions, though, he's almost always shown outside, because when we first see him, he's in the act of picking flowers. And he gives a long monologue, which is the first of several long speeches that he has in the play. Because he can be pretty long-winded, his part is usually abridged to a healthy degree, especially in movies. The friar's part, I will admit, is probably my favorite part. I'm not an actor, but if I got to pick any part that I'd like to play in Romeo and Juliet, I think the friar would be a lot of fun. Either the friar or Tybalt. And Tybalt only has 34 lines compared to the friar's 350. And actually, the friar and Tybalt are never in the same scene, so it is possible to do both. Anyway, the friar's opening speech here looks like this. He has 22 lines, after which Romeo is supposed to enter, and after the direction that Romeo enters, the friar has 8 more lines, which look like this. So let's go ahead and listen to some of this to get started. We're going to listen to 3 variations. We won't be making any big judgments based on these performances in terms of what's included and what's not. This exercise is merely for the purpose of seeing and hearing a few different versions of this speech to get familiar with what we're dealing with here. We actually don't have any version of the speech in a completely unabridged form, sadly. The 1976 TV movie would have been a complete version, except for the fact that they give the first 4 lines of the speech to Romeo at the end of scene 2.2, which we talked about in the last episode, and it's a decision that we support, even though it ultimately ended in tragedy for that contestant. The speech is missing in its entirety in a couple of our contestants, which are the 1936 movie and the 1968 movie, which is very regrettable. But it's somewhat understandable given that they are movies intended for a wide audience, and wide audiences usually don't care about the long speeches of the friar. I'm not saying I agree with it, I'm saying it's somewhat understandable. The speech is included partially in the 1954 movie and the 1996 movie, however, but only partially. So anyway, let's listen to a few selections. First, we will listen to 14 lines from the 2018 Royal Shakespeare Company performance. Then we'll listen to a 20-line selection from the 2009 Shakespeare's Globe performance. And then we'll listen to a different 14-line selection from the 1996 movie. And from these 3 selections, we should have a pretty good familiarity with the speech. First, the 2018, which looks like this. This will be Andrew French as the friar. Let's listen.
The gray-eyed morn smiles on the frowning night, checkering the eastern clouds with streaks of light, and fleckled darkness like a drunkard reels from fourth day's path and Titan's burning wheels. I must upfill this osier cage of ours with baleful weeds and precious juiced flowers. The earth, that's nature's mother, is her tomb. What is her burying grave, that is her womb, for naught so vile that on the earth doth live, but to the earth some special good doth give. Within the infant rind of this weak flower, poison hath residence, and medicine power. 2 such opposed kings encamp them still, in man as well as herbs, grace and rude will. Good morrow, Father.
Next will be the 2009, and this will be Rawiri Peritine playing the friar. Let's listen.
Now ere the sun advance his burning eye, the day to cheer and night's dank dew to dry, I must upfill this osier cage of ours with baleful weeds and precious juiced flowers. Oh, mickle is the powerful grace that lies in plants, herbs, stones, and their true qualities. For naught so vile that on the earth doth live, but to the earth some special good doth give. Nor aught so good, but strained from that fair use, revolts from true birth, stumbling on abuse. Virtue itself turns vice, being misapplied, and vice, sometime by action, dignified. Within the infant rind of this weak flower, poison hath residence and medicine power, for this, being smelt with that part, cheers each part, being tasted, stays all senses with the heart. Two such opposed kings encamp them still, in man as well as herbs, grace and rude will, and where the worser is predominant, full soon the cankered death eats up that plant.
Good morrow, Father.
The audience interaction here is really nice. Finally, the 1996, which looks like this, and this will be Pete Postlethwaite as the friar. Let's listen.
For naught so vile that on the earth doth live, but to the earth some special good doth give. And naught so good, but strained from that fair use, revolts from true birth, stumbling on abuse. Virtue itself turns vice, being misapplied, and vice, sometimes by action dignified. Within the infant rind of this weak flower, poison is resident, and medicine power. For this, being smelt with that part, cheers each part. Being tasted, slays all senses with the heart. Two such opposed kings encamp them still, in man as well as herbs, grace and rude will. And where the worser is predominant, full soon the canker death eats up that plant.
Good morrow, Father.
All right, so what are we going to do with this? So the contest in this round is going to be a little different. In this round, we are going to test how well our contestants honor what the friar is teaching in this monologue. Because we think the friar gives good counsel here about plants and herbs. I have to say herbs instead of herbs because I'm American. We agree with the friar's counsel about plants and herbs. We think he gives sage counsel, if you will. I also have a claim that I would like to make based on what the friar says. Consider the following lines in particular. Virtue itself turns vice, being misapplied, and vice sometime by action dignified. Obviously, first of all, this is foreshadowing the concoction that the friar will later give to Juliet. We'll talk more about that in a later episode. That's not what we want to talk about right now. We actually want to go backwards a little bit and talk some more about what happens in the orchard scene, which we talked about in the last episode. We have some unfinished business to take care of there. In the last episode, if you recall, we pointed out that in the 1978 BBC TV movie, there was a prominently featured palm tree next to Juliet's window, which looked like this. And what we said at the time was that this maybe was a trivial detail. The truth is, we absolutely don't believe it's a trivial detail. We think it's a significant detail, and we're sure that the friar would agree with us, because the friar understands the powerful qualities of herbs, plants, and stones, also flowers and weeds, which he also says, and also trees. The palm tree, I mentioned, had a literary significance having to do with Juliet calling Romeo a pilgrim in scene 1.5. But we think there's more significance than just that. What are the powerful qualities in these things, in plants and so forth? Besides the obvious, besides drugs, what are the powerful qualities? In the last episode, if you recall yet again, I also mentioned that the 1936 garden scene impressively contained probably the most beautiful garden of any version of that scene, even though it's in black and white. Let's revisit that garden, shall we? This is Romeo walking through the Capulet garden on his way to Juliet's window. Let's watch. The music helps a lot, I'll admit. I also said in the last episode that the 1996 garden scene probably contained the top contender for that title, with its Christmas lights and its swimming pool grotto. Let's revisit that garden, shall we? This is Romeo entering the garden from the 1996. This version, you will notice, also has a couple of small palm trees in it. Now, let's talk about what happens in the play Romeo and Juliet for just a minute. What happens is Romeo meets Juliet at the Capulet ancient feast, and less than 24 hours later, they get married. Romeo, as far as we are told, doesn't appear to sleep or even go home between the time that they meet and the time that they get married. The story is an example, if not the quintessential example, of what we would call love at first sight. So let's talk about love at first sight for a minute. Now, the idea of love at first sight is not something that everyone believes in. A lot of people roll their eyes and have a bad attitude about it. Just to be clear, when I say love at first sight, I mean love as in true and everlasting love. I'm not talking about shallow infatuation at first sight. We all agree that's a real possibility. And calling Romeo and Juliet's love a shallow infatuation is a very common interpretation of the play. It's not our interpretation, however. The interpretation that we prefer is that their love is true love. Perhaps when Romeo sees Juliet for literally the first time at the Capulet feast, when he says, "For I ne'er saw true beauty till this night," perhaps that was merely a superficial level attraction. But we believe that by the time Romeo and Juliet part at the end of the garden scene, they are both madly and deeply in love with each other. So instead of saying love at first sight, let's just say love in the first 24 hours, meaning true love in the first 24 hours. True enough to warrant a marriage. Now, the legality and the legitimacy of their marriage is a topic that we'll have to postpone for a later episode. For now, let's just call it true love in the first 24 hours, which is something that if it happens, when it happens, we would categorize as being something miraculous. And in Romeo and Juliet, it isn't just true love in the first 24 hours, it's mutual true love in the first 24 hours. Mutual true love in the first 24 hours is like rolling two different 1,000-sided dice and both dice simultaneously landing on the number 1,000. It's a 1 in a million prospect, and it makes the culminating tragedy even more tragically excellent, as it should be, according to the Q2 title page. Now, as I mentioned, I have a claim that I would like to make about all of this. My claim applies to Romeo and Juliet, but it isn't limited to Romeo and Juliet. It applies to everybody, okay? Feel free to agree or disagree, naturally. My claim is based on 3 things. It is based on the friar's teachings about the power that lies in plants and so forth. It is also based on what we witnessed in the Capulet Orchard in Act 2, Scene 2. And it is also based on my own personal experiences, which I don't talk about lightly. My claim is this. The miracle of mutual true love in the first 24 hours is a real possibility. However, it requires certain conditions. I already called it miraculous, and just like other miraculous things, such as lightning striking the primordial soup and creating life on earth as we know it, falling into mutual true love in the first 24 hours requires a certain set of special conditions that must be met. One of the conditions that I've discovered, there are probably others, but one of the conditions that I've discovered is a beautiful landscape setting. A beautiful landscape setting is required because a beautiful landscape setting has the power, potentially, to effectuate the sort of profound primeval influence over 2 people's souls that 2 people's souls require have influenced over them in order for the miracle to be effectuated on 2 people's souls, if it's to be effectuated on 2 people's souls at all. That might sound like dizzy arithmetic, but that's the best way I can describe it. I believe this phenomenon describes and explains what happens to Romeo and Juliet in the Capulet Garden. And I believe what happens in the garden happens not coincidentally in the garden, but conditionally on the garden. That's the power of beautiful stones, trees, and so forth that the garden has in it. It isn't drugs, it's better than drugs. If my theory is accurate, and I believe it is, and I believe the friar would agree with me, this spells trouble for one of our contestants. That contestant is the 2018 Royal Shakespeare Company stage play. Let's talk about Scene 2.2 in the 2018 RSC stage play, which we didn't get the chance to examine in the last episode. The 2018 RSC stage play does something weird, something very outside the box, as it were, and I'm sorry to say I think it was a big mistake. Now I want to be clear, there's nothing wrong with going outside the box, but just because something is outside the box, it doesn't mean that it's automatically good. Sometimes going outside the box can be a breath of fresh air, and sometimes you go outside the box and you step on a rake. In the 2018 Royal Shakespeare Theatre stage performance of Romeo and Juliet, they implement this rather large cube in the middle of the stage. The friar was sitting on this cube during his speech that we already saw. This element is unusual to say the least. It's switching things up, so I'll give it that. To reiterate, there's nothing wrong with doing something unusual or that switches things up. But the implementation of this large cube specifically is a problem for us at the Shakespeare Showdown show. As I said, we didn't get the chance to examine the orchard scene from this contestant in the last episode, because this contestant was exempt and immune from the possibility of elimination. But now, let's go to 2.2, the orchard scene, and see how it actually looks in this performance. We will start at the same place that we started our examination of the other contestants, with Romeo's line, "Love goes toward love." This is going to be Bally Gill as Romeo and Karen Fishwick as Juliet, and the big cube as the big cube. Obviously, Juliet is going to be up on top of the cube. That's the only place for her to be. So let's see how this goes.
Love goes toward love, the schoolboys from their books. But love from love, towards school with heavy looks.
Romeo?
It is my soul that calls upon my name.
Romeo!
Menaias!
At what o'clock tomorrow shall I send to thee?
By the hour of 9.
Will not fail. 'Tis 20 years till then. I have forgot why I did call thee back.
Let me stand here till I remember it.
Well, I shall forget to have thee still stand there, remembering how I love thy company.
And I'll still stay, to have thee still forgetting any other home but this.
So if you recall from the last episode, we discussed Juliet's problem with forgetfulness. This version does nothing to mitigate that problem, which is unfortunate and disappointing, and it doesn't do this contestant any favors, but that's small potatoes compared to the problems this big 7-foot-tall cube is causing. Look at Juliet's position here as she hunches over. That cannot be comfortable. Juliet is supposed to be on a balcony, traditionally. In fact, traditionally, that's probably the main reason that theaters have balconies, for Juliet. No one, and I mean no one, is falling in love on top of this cube. Certainly it's not happening in the first 24 hours. In fact, I bet it would be against the law to keep a prisoner on top of this cube for any period of time at all. It would be considered cruel and unusual punishment in the words of the 8th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Compared to the other versions of this scene, especially the gorgeous, breathtaking 1936 and 1996 versions, it's so much less convincing here that these are the conditions in which two people can fall madly and truly in love. This thing is more like a medieval torture device. Listen, I'm not trying to be picky, but is it too much to ask that in what is supposed to be the most romantic scene in the play, that the Geneva Conventions not be violated? We don't think that's too much to ask. Now, setting aside the cube for just a second, let's talk about the other problem, which is the complete lack of any landscape foliage. Now, you may be thinking, well, the 1936 movie and the 1996 movie were both Hollywood movies, so they had the luxury of having beautiful landscapes for Romeo and Juliet to miraculously fall in love in. That would be a fair point. Stage plays certainly enjoy fewer visual extravagances than movies do. The play, as it was originally performed in Shakespeare's day, definitely would have relied on the audiences imagining the Capulet Garden in their own minds. It would have looked similar to the Globe performance which we watched, which contained no trees or plants except for the friar's flowers. The trees and foliage and so forth in Juliet's garden are things that the audience can be expected to and are expected to imagine. The problem is that defense doesn't fly for the 2018 Royal Shakespeare Theatre production, because the 2018 Royal Shakespeare Theatre production proactively includes a very lovely and lush visual backdrop. They just give it to us in the scene in the Friar's Garden instead of the scene in Juliet's garden. The reason for including it in the Friar's Garden is obvious, the Friar's commentary on the virtues of plants and flowers. But in light of the Friar's commentary on the virtues of plants and flowers, we must insist that any available lush visual backdrops be applied toward the scene in Juliet's garden, because that's the garden where the magic happens. That's where we need the quote-unquote powerful grace. The play is Romeo and Juliet, after all, not Romeo and the Friar. Although that would be interesting, that's a play for another day. We don't need the lovely, lush greenery to cradle anything delicate happening between Romeo and the Friar. We do need the lovely and lush greenery to cradle the delicate and miraculous thing that happens between Romeo and Juliet in scene 2.2. But instead, in the Royal Shakespeare Company play, we get that in scene 2.3, and in scene 2.2, we get a big cube. In the words of the friar, virtue itself turns vice, being misapplied. Now, I'm not sure the lush visuals could have fully redeemed the cube in scene 2.2, but it couldn't have hurt. Also, I don't think that the cube can be redeemed by the starry night visuals either. I get the references to stars, but we already made our astronomical preferences for this scene known, and that was that the sun should already be starting to come up. So a starry night isn't what we want either. For evidence that this situation is not conducive to falling in love, and not just that it's more likely actively destroying the possibility of it happening, let's just listen to how badly Juliet complains to Romeo when she says the line, "Well, do not swear." This is how it sounds when Juliet is on top of the cube.
Swear by thy gracious self, which is the god of my idolatry, and I'll believe thee.
If my heart's dear love...
Well, do not swear.
That's pretty rough stuff. Look, I try to be pretty open-minded about a lot of things. I try to be open-minded about Romeo and Juliet falling in love in the first 24 hours. I try to be open-minded about Romeo and Juliet getting married in the first 24 hours. But the one thing that I cannot abide, the one thing that I refuse to go along with, is Juliet already starting to nag Romeo in the first 24 hours. That's where I draw the line. Compare that line, as delivered from the top of a cube, to the same line as it is delivered from the swimming pool grotto in the 1996 movie. Let's listen to how this sounds.
Swear by thy gracious self, which is the god of my idolatry, and I'll believe thee.
My heart's dear love.
Do not swear.
To me, that's like night and day, speaking of the sun starting to come up. So, with that, we say farewell to the 2018 Royal Shakespeare Company play. You are now eliminated. Parting is such sweet sorrow. But we're not even close to being done with business today. We've got a couple more things to discuss. First, a few more opinions about this cube, just to wrap up our consideration of this contestant. In some respects, the cube is interesting. At the end of the play, for example, when Juliet is lying in the Capulet monument, they have her lying on top of the cube, and it actually looks really cool. And I will say that that scene, the final scene, is in other respects very interesting. They do a bunch of other things that go outside the box, and it's really cool, and it's worth watching. But overall, the cube causes more stress than it's worth. In Act 3, Scene 1, for example, when Tybalt and Mercutio fight each other, they fight on top of this cube. And it's really awkward because it takes them forever to climb up it. It's basically just a huge obstacle in the middle of the stage for no good reason, besides going outside the box. I mean, it's supposed to be a street fight in Verona, not on the top of Hamlet's castle. It's really confusing and stressful, and not in a good way. As I've said many times, they went outside the box with this one, so I suppose they do deserve some extra credit points for that, so I'll give them that. But it doesn't always pay off, which is very disappointing, especially since we crave seeing things that go outside the box. Sometimes, when people go outside the box, it ends up feeling like they're doing it just for going outside the box's sake. And when you start doing that, you can really get into some trouble. You want to go outside the box, that's fine. But you gotta be bringing something fresh to the table, you know? You gotta be bringing some aqua vitae to the story. And actually, the 1996 movie, which we have been praising to high heaven, is guilty of this too, of going outside the box to not so fresh effect, in our opinion. There's nothing wrong with the garden scene. That scene is basically perfect. And Romeo and Juliet making out in the swimming pool certainly qualifies as aqua vitae. And just to make it official, the Shakespeare Showdown show advocates for pools of water in all Capulet gardens, which the 1936 had as well 60 years earlier, even though Romeo and Juliet didn't take full advantage of it. Even for a theater performance, pools of water are optimal. The 1998 theater performance of Twelfth Night, starring Helen Hunt as Viola, had a pool of water on stage, which means it's possible. But as I was saying, the 1996 Romeo and Juliet movie is guilty of going outside the box to stale effect in other areas. For example, in scene 1.4, which is the scene where Romeo is with his companions Benvolio and Mercutio gives the Queen Mab speech, this is a scene that we skipped over, and we're not going to study that speech now either. But in this scene, 1.4, Mercutio gives Romeo, in the 1996 version, a little pill. Romeo takes the pill, which induces a psychedelic trip of some sort, and thusly, under the influence of this drug, Romeo goes with his lusty gentleman companions to the Capulet feast. We're not sure what the point of that recreational drug use is, except to give director Baz Luhrmann a chance to inject his own personal flair and signature to the show, which it certainly does, and that's fine. But as far as the story is concerned, we would say it's a pretty pointless exercise in going outside the box. It's not as detrimental to the story as The Cube is, because Romeo's hallucinations do wear off pretty quickly before he sees Juliet, but it possibly diminishes the Queen Mab speech a little, and at best the effect that it has on the story is neutral. Now, if there's one thing that I cannot abide, besides Juliet nagging Romeo in the first 24 hours, it's when people make criticism without putting up something creative of their own. So, because I've criticized the Royal Shakespeare Company Cube, as well as Baz Luhrmann's Queen Mab drug use, I will now offer my own suggestion for how to take the Romeo and Juliet story outside the box. You want to go outside the box? Let's go outside the box. Let's get crazy. This is how I would do the Friar's monologue. This incorporates ideas that we've discussed so far about the Friar's monologue in scene 2.3, as well as my theory about the powerful effects of plants and gardens, and it also puts my own spin on Romeo's drug use from scene 1.4 from the 96 movie, which, for better or for worse, is forever in the all-time Romeo and Juliet library. You ready for this? Get comfy. Picture this. At the end of scene 1.4, when Romeo is with Benvolio and Mercutio, he begins to lag behind his companions. This is how the 1968 movie does it. In fact, let's watch this. So Romeo here is lagging behind his companions, and he gives a short speech about "My mind misgives some consequence yet hanging in the stars." And this is what it looks like from the 1968 movie.
Romeo, we shall arrive too late. I fear too early, for my mind misgives some consequence yet hanging in the stars shall bitterly begin his fearful date with this night's revels, and expire the term of a despised life closed in my breast by some vile forfeit of untimely death. But he that hath the steerage of my course direct my sail.
So imagine this. Romeo is lagging behind his companions, and he gives this speech exactly like we saw. And as he's doing it, you have the friar, who's been lurking in the shadows, like in a dark Verona alley. He stealthily sneaks up behind Romeo as Romeo is giving the speech. Then, as Romeo finishes saying the line, "He that hath the steerage of my course, direct my sail," at that exact moment, the friar suddenly tackles Romeo from behind and performs a maneuver on him in which he puts him in like a headlock with like a chloroform rag over his mouth, like Jim Carrey does to the Miami Dolphins football player in Ace Ventura: Pet Detective. making Romeo black out unconscious. So the friar is cradling the blacked out Romeo in his arms, and he gently lays him on the ground face up. Then he reaches into his tunic and pulls out a sprig of some sort of mysterious, bright-colored flower, like a fantastic made-up-looking flower that no one would recognize, like the ones in A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's like some unique plant that the friar somehow got his hands on, possibly with connections to the world of the fairies. Then the friar begins his speech from scene 2.3. You cut it out from that scene and paste it right here, beginning with the line, "Oh, mickle is the powerful grace that lies in herbs, plants, stones, and their true qualities." The first 4 lines of the speech should be given to Romeo as advocated for in episode 3. Anyway, the friar continues, "For not so vile that on the earth doth live, but to the earth some special good doth give, nor aught so good but strained from that fair use, revolts from true birth, stumbling on abuse." Skipping ahead, within the infant rind of this small flower, poison hath residence and medicine power, as he holds up the flower to show the audience. And then he says, "For this, being smelt, with that part cheers each part, being tasted, slays all senses with the heart." And as he says this, he pins the flower to Romeo's clothes, like on his lapel or something. So he gives the speech through the line, "Being tasted, slays all senses with the heart." And then after doing this, he looks around to make sure no one saw him, and then he hurries away, escaping back into the dark alley or whatever. Romeo then begins to slowly wake up. He's foggy, disoriented, like Bottom waking up in A Midsummer Night's Dream. He looks around, wondering what happened. He notices the flower pinned to his clothes. He's vaguely confused by it, but he smells the flower, and it energizes him. He gets up, and his companions come back to retrieve him, and that's when he yells, "On, lusty gentlemen," and they all run away to the Capulet feast. So what happens after that, in scene 1.5, at the Capulet feast, everything proceeds as normal, except Romeo is feeling super euphoric. He sees Juliet and he suffers massive twitterpation at first sight. He approaches Juliet just like normal, and they have their first interaction just like normal. At some point during this interaction, though, Juliet smells the flower pinned to Romeo's shirt, which makes her suddenly feel euphoric as well, and likewise suffer massive twitterpation. Then, scene 2.2 happens, the orchard scene, just like normal, with all of the points that I've advocated for so far, palm trees, the sun starting to come up, the whole shebang. Then, when we get to scene 2.3, when Romeo visits the friar's part will now sound a little different than usual. For example, when the friar says the line, "Our Romeo hath not been in bed tonight," he's saying it in a knowing way, like he already knows where Romeo was the previous night. When he says the line, "Holy Saint Francis, what a change is here," he's saying it ironically, as if he's amazed by it, when in reality the audience knows that it was he who was the perpetrator of the previous night's miraculous proceedings. And when the friar says, "In one respect all thy assistant be," it's also ironic because the whole sequence of events was now set into motion, the audience knows, by the manipulations of the friar. So in this way, the friar's whole role in the play, which was already one of an intervening manipulator because he agrees to perform the clandestine marriage, now his role gets amplified. Now he's like this major instigator who's even more responsible for everything that happens. He's kind of like an agent of mischief, like the hobgoblin from A Midsummer Night's Dream, except the friar's motives are totally pure because he's doing it to try to resolve the mutinous rivalry that exists in Verona between the two households. So he's trying to solve this problem from the get-go, and he employs the only means that he has, the only ones that he knows, his horticultural resources, which isn't at all unlike what he does later with Juliet and the sleeping potion. The rest of the play can be the same. The friar's manipulations backfire, just like they're supposed to. Nothing else has to change. If you did that, it would put a new spin on the friar's part. It might detract somewhat from the free agency element of Romeo and Juliet's love affair. It would be more like Demetrius and Helena's love, which was induced by plants. But is that really any worse than being the random victim of Cupid's metaphorical childish bow, to which we all fall a victim sooner or later? Well, at least it wouldn't be some pointless psychedelic detour, and at least no international treaties or constitutional amendments would be violated, which is something. Anyway, that's my idea. On the next episode of the Shakespeare Showdown show, with 6 contestants remaining in the tournament, we will be discussing a topic that I said would be discussed in a later episode, and that is the topic of Romeo and Juliet's marriage, and the complications surrounding that, both legal and illegal, including what is the only topic that some people ever want to talk about, the topic of Juliet's age. We will be tackling that subject and more next time on the Shakespeare Showdown show. Thanks for watching.